everybody. Welcome to Webinar 1 of the 2019 IEP Ambassador Program. Thank you for your patience. First of all, if you could please type 1 in the chat box if you can hear me. Wonderful. I'm seeing a lot of 1s coming up. So I'm going to get started. My name is Lori Smolensky, and I join you from the Institute for Economics and Peace. I'm here in New York, and I'm thrilled to be kicking off this first webinar. Once again, thank you for your patience. It wouldn't be a webinar with a few awkward moments in the beginning when all the presenters are getting on the same page. So thank you. I'm extremely pleased to be joined tonight by 2 IEP researchers who you'll hear from briefly. We have Mohib Akbal and Paulo Pinto, who I'll formally introduce in a moment. And we also have Rob helping us on the Ready Talk side. Some of you have engaged with him in the chat box. So first of all, congratulations to all of you for being selected as part of the 2019 IEP Ambassador Program. So before I turn it over to Mohib and Paulo, I'm going to give you a brief overview of IEP and the IEP Ambassador Program. Then I'm going to turn it over to them to go through the majority of the webinar, and then we're going to have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And if you have any problems with your audio or with your connection throughout, feel free to write that in the chat box. This webinar will not last longer than 90 minutes, and everything is recorded. So if you miss anything, don't worry, you can view it all afterwards. So first of all, to begin, the Institute for Economics and Peace. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, independent think tank that develops new conceptual frameworks to define and measure peace. We work to uncover the relationship between peace, business, and economic prosperity, and we also seek to promote a better understanding of the factors that drive peace. Essentially, we seek to quantify peace in order to better understand it, and to really shift the global paradigm around peace as a very sustainable, achievable, tangible measure of human progress and development. So as you can see here, our offices and our headquarters, I should say, and our research team are based in Sydney, Australia. So Mohib and Paulo got up early for you all this morning. I join you from New York, and we also have offices in The Hague, Mexico City, and Brussels. These are our core research reports. These are all annual reports. And today you're going to hear more about the Global Peace Index, that report in the middle, and the Positive Peace Report next to it on the right. Paulo and Mohib are going to go over the methodology of those 2 reports as well as some top-line findings. First, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Ambassador Program. So this is the 4th annual IEP Ambassador Program and our largest yet. I know it's hard to tell from the webinar, but we have more than 550 ambassadors as part of the program this year from all around the world. And IEP ambassadors, as you can imagine, comprise an incredibly international network of peace builders from diverse academic backgrounds and professional fields and sectors. We have many ambassadors who are representing One Young World and who are Rotary Peace Fellows and alumni. And if you're wondering what those are, don't worry. On our second webinar, we're going to introduce some of our partners, Rotary and One Young World, and tell you a bit more about both of those programs. And many of you have no affiliation, which is great. I want to really welcome you all to this program for 2019. Now, as you probably know, the goal of this program is twofold. The IEP Ambassador Program was designed to provide peace builders with new ways of analyzing and articulating peace. So this includes an understanding of our research findings and methodologies, along with some very simple tools to communicate innovative peace research. And these tools are primarily a PowerPoint and a script, which you'll hear more about. And then more broadly, we seek to build a network of peace builders who can really share ideas and knowledge with the goal of building peace within your own communities, sectors, universities, and so forth. Now, to that end, because a key element of this program is networking, if you use Facebook, please join the IEP Ambassador Facebook page if you haven't already. Now, just to recap, as most of you know, there's two primary components of this program. First, over the next 2 months or so, you'll participate in a total of 2 to 3 webinars. So this first webinar today, as I mentioned, you'll hear about the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index. And then in May, you'll hear from some of our partners, as well as IEP Ambassador alumni, and you'll hear more about the project component, which I'll come to in a minute. And then our third webinar, you'll hear about the Global Peace Index. We'll brief you on the latest findings from that report, and we'll provide some training so that you'll be able to, in turn, articulate those findings to your networks. Then throughout the second half of the year, from roughly July to December, ambassadors are expected to utilize the knowledge that you've gained to present IEP's findings and frameworks in some capacity to your own community by doing a presentation or by executing a creative peace project of your choice. So again, you have two options. After the June release of the GPI, you can take the materials that we'll share with you, modify them for your own purposes, and present those findings within your own network. So you'll be helping us to disseminate the findings of the Global Peace Index and ensure that it's relevant for broad networks of peace builders. Or if you're not so keen to give a presentation, you can undertake a creative project of your choice. That might be executing a small workshop or a social media campaign. IEP is not prescriptive here. It's exciting for us to see what ambassadors have come up with in the past. And as I mentioned on this next webinar that's scheduled in May, we'll be in touch to let you know the exact dates and times. You'll hear from ambassador alumni who will share some of the things that they're working on. Now, one more person who I want to introduce, although she's not with us today, is our colleague Elise. Some of you have engaged with her. She's based in Sydney, and she's our social media guru and the mastermind behind Ambassador Communications. She has some tremendous ideas about how to connect you all and really amplify your work. So please stay tuned to hear from Elise on our next webinar. And then the last element of the program is after you've participated by attending the webinars or by viewing them, viewing the recordings, undertake your presentation or project. Then we'll ask you to report back using a standardized form. And then at the very end of this year or early 2020, you'll receive a letter of completion, and you'll be invited to stay on as an ambassador alumni. So that concludes my portion now. I'm very pleased to turn it over to Mohib and Paulo, who are two of our researchers, as I mentioned, based in Sydney, Australia, who are best positioned to really unpack our research for you. All right, guys, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laurie. Mohib here, Mohib and Paulo from Sydney. We are thrilled to be with you, one of sort of the largest network around IEP work. From what I see in the screen, I think it's around 100 countries. So I will be presenting the Global Peace Index and some of the economic of peace work that we do. And Paulo here, who leads the positive peace work, will discuss positive peace when we reach those slides. So I'll get into it straight away. So Global Peace Index is one of our main measures of negative peace, as we call it. And to give you a little bit on the negative and positive peace is that peace is defined in two different ways. We define negative peace as the absence of violence or fear of violence. And the positive peace is structures, institutions, and attitudes that build peace in a society. And my colleague, Paulo Pinto, will get in detail into that, and I will lay out the sort of the methodology and some of the results from positive peace. Global Peace Index covers around 163 countries. Are the slides moving, Lori?
I can move the slides for you.
Sure, it's moving now. Yeah.
Feel free to
So
indicate when you want them to move forward.
Sure, thank you. So Global Peace Index ranks 163 countries and territories according to their relative state of peace. It uses 23 indicators in 3 different categories. It's developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and we have a panel of international experts, both economists and peace researchers around the world. They provide their inputs and sort of a peer review function. The data for the index is collected and collated by Economic Intelligence Unit and by the Institute for Economics and Peace. And the index is now in its 12th year. This slide represents our GPI expert panel. So we have Professor Kevin Clements, that's the chairperson, who is the foundation chair of Peace and Conflict Studies in University of Otago, New Zealand. Then we have Dr. Sabina Alcair, that she's the director of Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative in the Oxford University in the United Kingdom. We have Ian Anthony, who is the research coordinator and director of programs for arms controls and disarmament and non-proliferation. He works for CIPRI in Sweden, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Then we have Ms. Isabella Aradun, Director of Research and Deputy Director of Communication for the Crisis Group in Belgium. Dr. Manuela Mesa, she works for Center for Education and Peace Research. She's based in Spain, in Madrid. And then finally we have Dr. Ekaterina Stepanova. She's the head of Peace and Conflict Studies, the Institute of the World Economy and International Relations. So the Global Peace Index, as I measured, is 23 indicators. There is 6 measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict, 10 measures of societal safety and security, and 7 measures of militarization. The ongoing domestic and international conflict indicators include number and duration of internal conflicts. This comes from the UCDP, or a database that is based in Uppsala University, and they collect annual data on conflict deaths, conflict duration, and the number of conflicts happening around the world. The second indicator, that is the number of deaths from external organized conflict, that also comes from UCDP, the same database collected by Uppsala University. We have the number of deaths from internal organized conflict, and that also comes from the same database. In addition to that, we use the International Institute for Strategic Studies and Armed Conflict database. Number and duration and role of external conflict, that comes from UCDP, and UCDP stands from the first sort of variable Uppsala Conflict Data Program. That is in Uppsala University. So that comes from there. And the intensity of organized conflict is a qualitative assessment by EIU analysts. So EIU, they have a network of analysts around the world, and they are country specialists, and they provide inputs on individual countries and rank them on these variables and some of the other variables that we are going to see in the next slide. Relations with neighboring countries, qualitative assessment by EIU. Social safety and security, which is one of sort of the largest category. It has the level of perceived criminality in society. This is another qualitative assessment. Number of refugees and internally displaced people as a percentage of population. That statistic come from UNHCR and from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Combining these two provides us with the scale of displacement inside countries and outside countries. And then we have political instability. This is a qualitative assessment. Then we have political terror scale. This comes from a specific study that they update every year and provides the political terror scale for 163 countries. Then we have, in the same domain, we have the impact of terrorism. This comes from our own Global Terrorism Index, but the data for this one comes from GTD. That is a global terrorism database based in the University of Maryland in the United States. Then we have number of homicides per 100,000 people, which we called homicide rate. That comes from UNODC, or United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The data is collected by a survey of crime trend and operation of criminal justice system. The UNODC updates this every year, and in some cases every 2 years. And for some countries where the homicide rate is not available, the Economic Intelligence Unit provides us with the estimates for those countries. Then we have level of violent crime. This is another qualitative assessment by EIU analyst. Likelihood of violent demonstration, another EIU assessment. A number of jail population that comes from the World Prison Brief, Institute for Criminal Policy Research, University of London. And then we have the number of internal security officers and police per 100,000. We call this police rate, but it also includes other security officers such as private security and so on. And this also comes from the UNODC survey, that the Crime Trend and Operation of Criminal Justice System survey that they conduct, I think, every 2 years. The militarization domain, which is the third domain of Global Peace Index, has military expenditure as a percentage of GDP. This comes from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. They have a database called the Military Balance. Number of armed service personnel per 100,000 people. That's another sort of the variable. And that also comes from the military balance of ISS. Now, sort of the other variables includes weapons and conventional weapons, the two variables, imports and exports of those two variables, and that comes from SIPRI and sort of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They have an armed transfer database that they maintain regularly and updated for 163 countries. Then we have the financial contribution to UN peacekeeping missions. This data comes from the United Nations Committee on Contributions, and Institute for Economics and Peace takes the data and collates it and prepares it for the index. Then we have the nuclear and heavy weapon capabilities. This also comes from the military balance and is partially sort of supplemented by SIPRI and the UN Registration of Conventional Arms. And the Institute for Economics and Peace puts this variable together. The last sort of variable is ease of access to small arms and light weapons. This is a qualitative assessment by EU analysts. So this three domains provides the structure of the Global Peace Index. And this is how, when we do the analysis, we also break down the index into these three major domains and look at each, because each of them provide a different indication for each countries. And later on, we will see when we look at different regions, sometimes different regions are affected by different type of changes in the variables, and that affects their level of peace. The Global Peace Index ranks each of these indicators, scores each of these indicators from 1 to 5, and each indicator have its own weight within the composite index. So what we do is we put all these 23 indicators in 3 different domains together. Each gets a specific weight, and what we mean by that specific weight is that its impact on the whole index is actually determined by these weights, and these weights are provided in this slide. Sort of the largest weights comes from the conflict-related indexes, and it comes from neighboring country relations, and then we have some of the sort of the smallest weights come from military expenditure, and the reason for that is military. For example, if I give you one example, we take military expenditure as the larger it gets, the less peaceful the country becomes, and we weigh it smaller because we don't think the internal sort of the military expenditure is entirely sort of negative on peace. There's a certain level of military expenditure that is needed, but it's when it gets beyond a certain level, that's where it becomes a negative impact on peace. So what we do is, with the structure of the Global Peace Index, what happens is that these 3 different the 3 different domains functions as a sub-index measure and come together to form the whole Global Peace Index. And this slide shows the following 6 sort of variables that are collected and compiled by Institute for Economics and Peace. I think I did mention them when I was going through the previous slides, but I will quickly sort of go through it again. So nuclear and heavy weapons capability, we count this for each country, and for a lot of countries this is 0. There is only a certain number of countries that have that. UN funding, we take the data from the United Nations Contribution Committee and put it together. Then the impact of terrorism, the data comes from Global Terrorism Database, or GTD, that is collected and maintained by University of Maryland in the United States. We collect the number of displaced people that comes from IDMC and the UNHCR, and the number and duration of internal conflicts that comes from UCDP, or the Uppsala Conflict Database Program. And then we have number and role of external conflict that also comes from UCDP, or the Uppsala Conflict Database Program. That is based in Norway in the Uppsala University. The Global Peace Index, as we mentioned earlier, is in its 12th year. Some of the major achievement of the Global Peace Index is that it has brought a focus on a critical dimension of progress. What this means is that with the Global Peace Index, we have provided a tool for the researchers and for sort of a global expert community to measure peace and provide sort of discussion around progress, whether peace is improving or deteriorating in a certain country, in a specific region, or on a global level, which when we get to the results section, we will discuss how peace is changing. Our methodology is now widely accepted, and it has been sort of peer-reviewed by a panel of experts that we discussed in the previous slides. But also there is a huge body of academic literature that is emerging and has emerged over the last 12 years that uses Global Peace Index or provides sort of a discussion around Global Peace Index. IEP's material and Global Peace Index in particular has been used in many universities as a course material, And we have some of the examples from Northeastern University in the United States. It's Stanford University. One of our researchers, who is now the director of research team, used to teach in London, King's College in London, and we did that for 3 to 4 years. And a number of researchers in Asia, in Thailand, and other places also use IEPs research broadly, but Global Peace Index in particular for their teaching purpose. Now, measuring peace through a composite index, which brings 23 indicators in 3 domains together, has a lot of benefits, and some of the benefits we sort of touched on in the previous slide, providing a measure that progress could be measured on, providing a measure of peace that could be used both in teaching and in research, and that could be used in policy, both in global policy settings such as the United Nations and other institutions, global institutions, but also on country governments, that they can sort of look at their progress of their peace, or which indicators are sort of driving the improvements or deterioration in their levels of peace. So the pros of using a composite measure is that it summarizes a complex sort of and multidimensional issue into a easy to understand and easy to visualize measure. This facilitates a comparison based on big picture, as we said, sort of the international institutional sort of policy, but also a country level policy. What it does is it makes them avoid looking at a huge variety of indicators to understand, as we said, something that is multidimensional and complex, and that is peace. It also can serve as a monitoring and evaluation tool, and provides accountability. And one example for this is the recent SDG sort of process, where in SDGs, or sort of specifically the SDG 16, which is the goal for peace and security, it has hundreds of sort of indicators that needs to be monitored to measure progress. Instead, Global Peace Index sort of provides a ready-made and available indicator that could sort of measure the progress of the overall Goal 16 or Goal 16 plus that they as it's called in the Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Peace Index is broadly sort of accepted and sort of broadly disseminated, and it attracts a lot of public interest. It also attracts policymakers' interest. It also attracts media interest, which I'll get into it a little bit later. Some of our report gets thousands and thousands of downloads, and our sort of the following and the media coverage goes into billions of people that we are later on going to touch on and explain that. However, that said, every sort of measure or every model of measurement also has its downside, and in some cases, what happens is it's not the measure that provides any of that sort of implication that are sort of on the negative side. But what with Global Peace Index, what happens is that it sometimes invites simplistic policy conclusions. One of our strategy at IEP is that we do not provide specific policy advice in the global framework of research that we provide. When we provide relevant and specific advice on something that comes in our consulting work and that comes in our projects that we do with specific organizations for specific purposes. Apart from that, IEP does not sort of provide policy advice in its report. What we do is we are more a descriptive, we provide descriptive analysis of trends in the indicators and the domains of peace and peace itself. So that's why sometimes it's easy for policymakers or policy advisors and people in that arena to draw some conclusions. While IEP puts a lot of effort into bringing all this data together, doing a lot of checking, and have a very robust process of making sure that the Global Peace Index is developed properly, it's statistically robust, it has all the data it needs, but when composite indicators are used and they're poorly constructed, they can create misleading sort of conclusions. And another thing that could happen is that it could have Global Peace Index and all the sort of measures of composite indexes could be taken out of context. What Global Peace Index provides is a measure of peacefulness around the world, and it's relative to sort of relative between the 163 countries included in the index. And it sort of draws from the indicators included within the index. Some people might sort of take, and it has happened that Global Peace Index could be taken out of context and could be interpreted in a way that it's not intended for. And that's another thing that we pay a lot of attention to, that when we draw interpretations and conclusions from Global Peace Index, that they are close to the subject matter, they're relevant, and they are based on the data and the variables included within the index and not outside the bounds of these indicators and data that is part of the Global Peace Index. So what we so far went through is the more technical and more sort of research part of the methodological part of the Global Peace Index. I don't think we need to remember anything from there. I think it's good to have these information and to have an overview of this. And I think the detail on these, the previous slides are available in Global Peace Index. We have a number of appendixes that you can refer to at times and sort of discuss questions around it and discuss sort of the details around that. And they're written pretty much in detail. All the data sources and all the sort of methodological details are available there. But now we're going to get into the fun part, which is the results and findings of Global Peace Index. As we said, Global Peace Index is now in its 12th year. This map shows us a visualization of Global Peace Index by each country around the world. And this is the 2018 Global Peace Index. In the map, what we see is the red shows us the least peaceful countries, and the dark green sort of shows us the most peaceful countries. One of the sort of star points, or one of sort of the outstanding parts of this map for myself, is that if you remove Russia, which is red and pretty big in the global map, there is actually very few countries that are the least peaceful countries. And what this means is that the strongest sort of deterioration of peace or the strongest lack of peace or absence of peace is in a very small number of countries. And as a world, we can actually do something about it. And that's one of sort of the main thing, that when we visualize peace, it's actually achievable, it's actually tangible, and it's actually measurable in this sense. And then we see all the other colors, and sort of there's a variation around the world. And later on, when we get to sort of regional discussion, we will see how it varies by regions and how it varies by different countries around the world. Now, some of the highlights or some of the main findings from the 2018 Global Peace Index were that in 2018, global peace deteriorated by a small margin, only 0.27%, but the fact that it deteriorated, that is important. Now, it's not very easy to sort of understand what does 0.27% or 0.27% deterioration means. I think one way to make that a little bit more clear is to look at the number of countries that improved and the number of countries that deteriorated. So 71 countries became more peaceful and 92 countries deteriorated in their peacefulness. What this means is that when we say deterioration, this does not mean that countries went from being peaceful to not peaceful. And this is the beauty of GPI, that it provides a sort of a continuous spectrum of sort of measure. It's a measure not sort of from one point to another, but rather on a spectrum. So if a country moves a small in one variable, sort of by a small measure, it will affect its overall peacefulness, and that overall deterioration will reflect in the Global Peace Index. But it does not mean that that country fell into a conflict or that country experienced a gang violence or some sort of other sort of political instability or all those things. It could be one of those things. For example, in 2011, many countries experienced, and that's part of the Global Peace Index, a fall in their peacefulness, and some of them experienced a very drastic fall. For example, Syria went from a sort of medium peace country to suddenly being in a huge catastrophic conflict. Similar thing happened in Libya, in Egypt, in a number of other countries, and that sort of the post-Arab uprising period sort of experienced a deterioration in peace. But also sort of the rise of political fragmentation in the European region. Some countries became more polarized in terms of political instability, and that also sort of showed in their peacefulness score, and some of the countries actually deteriorated on Global Peace Index. Now, deteriorations in 2018 were primarily driven by political terror and intensity of internal conflict, and this intensity of internal conflict, unfortunately, was sort of in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and in some countries in the African continent. There was also the Ukrainian conflict, and the Venezuelan sort of deep instability has also sort of reflects in that intensity of internal conflict variable. And there were also some improvements with the 71 countries that improved in peacefulness. There were two main drivers behind that. The global military expenditure started to decline, which is sort of a good sign, and the impact of terrorism. Terrorism and conflict sort of experienced a peak in 2014, and since then fortunately has started to come down. And what we mean by the impact of terrorism is the number of people that were killed due to terrorist attacks and the number of people that were wounded because of terrorist attacks. But it also includes if a country experienced a single or one or more terrorist incidents. So these are the three measures that come together to form the terrorism impact. And since 2014, that has shown a decline. And as that level of violence declines, peace improves. So those were the two variables. I can see some questions as well on the 2.7% deterioration. I think I sort of went through the deterioration happens. One of the reason was intensity of internal conflict and political terror, and the improvement that happened in the 71 countries. So we can definitely come back to this and have a discussion around this. But it's sort of we provide an overview of what sort of drove the deterioration in the Global Peace Index. South America had the largest regional deterioration, and that's sort of what is happening in Venezuela is one of the major drivers of that. Venezuela went from a middle-income country with relatively stable government and stable social system into a very divided and sort of a dictatorial system where there are severe economic sanctions now. There is a huge migration crisis that is happening. People from Venezuela are displaced and they're moving into Colombia and other regions, other countries in the region. And as I mentioned, there were deterioration in Europe and North America and Asia Pacific. The European and North American deterioration were particularly due to political polarization in these societies, and those sort of reflected in Global Peace Index. Regionally, when we look at the regions of the world, Europe remains the most peaceful region. In 2018, it recorded a small deterioration, but despite that deterioration, it's still the most peaceful region around the world. South Asia had the largest regional improvement, although it was sort of relatively small. In South Asia region, there is an ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. There was also an ongoing conflict and insurgency in Pakistan. There is also a number of conflicts, small conflicts in India. And there was also a conflict in Nepal. And all of these conflicts has shown improvement, except for Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a deterioration, and the war sort of got worse, and the number of deaths and casualties went sort of into on the bad sort of side. But the improvements in Pakistan, the improvements in India and Nepal drove the improvements in the regional score for Global Peace Index. Now, sorry, I was quickly reading some of the questions and discussions that are coming through. There are questions on military expenditure and other questions. We will get to that discussion towards the end of the presentation. Now, the 10 most peaceful countries here shown on this chart. Iceland has been the most peaceful countries for a number of years. New Zealand has been the most peaceful, sort of one of the most peaceful countries, the second most peaceful country in this case. Austria, Portugal, Denmark, Canada, Czech Republic, or Singapore, Japan, and Ireland. Singapore, Japan, and Canada, and New Zealand are the countries sort of outside the European region, and the rest of them sort of are all European countries, and that's why Europe is one of the most peaceful regions around the world. And now we get to the least peaceful countries. As I mentioned when we were discussing on the map, that peace is actually a long-tail distribution, or when we say long-tail distribution, what it means is that there is a smaller number of countries that are the least peaceful, and they have the level of violence and conflict there is very high. And then we have the whole rest of the world where there's, of course, the European region, which is very peaceful, and the rest of the countries sort of in the middle piece. But actually, the least peaceful countries are a very small number of countries. So these countries are mainly Syria, Afghanistan, and at the top of these countries, you would see the countries that are in protracted and very deep conflicts. And these conflicts have been, unfortunately, very bloody and very brutal conflicts. The conflict in Syria has killed hundreds of thousands of people and has displaced millions of people, both regionally and in beyond region. And many of you might have seen the news of people moving to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Turkey, and even the European migrant crisis of 2014 was sort of related to both Syria and Afghanistan conflicts. Then we have South Sudan, which all have experienced a civil war recently. Iraq has experienced a terrorism-related violence. We have Somalia that is experiencing a sort of a failed state situation where there is no central authority or central government to keep the country together, to create the system and structures that can govern a country, and that's why there is Boko Haram and sort of Al-Shabaab are sort of, creating violence and perpetrating violence. Yemen experienced a internationalized conflict. Libya, another sort of post-Arab uprising country that is experiencing a large conflict. Libya was also an upper middle income country, which improved in 2018, but unfortunately, since the last 3 months, it has experienced another round of civil war where different militia groups are trying to control the capital of the country. Congo also experienced a return to a sort of a small relapse into conflict. Central African Republic, even though it improved in 2018, has been experiencing a conflict, and Russia sort of declined, is part of those 10 least peaceful countries, but Russia's role in the Ukrainian and Syrian conflict actually puts Russia in that category, but also there are other issues within Russia that are included in the Global Peace Index that puts the country in one of the least peaceful, or at least in the 10 least peaceful countries. Here are some of the improvements. I think I quickly touched on some of them. Qatar sort of dropped by a small amount, but it dropped by 56 places, and this was one of the reasons for this is that one variable that we have is its relationship with neighboring countries, and Qatar in 2017 and 18 had an embargo on it, placed on it by Saudi, UAE, and some other Arab countries, and the relationship between Qatar and these countries has deteriorated, and that puts Qatar as one of the most deteriorated countries. The DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, experienced a rise, sort of a conflict. Spain suffered from a separatist movement, and there were demonstrations and sort of political instability in the country, and Myanmar also experienced a conflict within sort of the Myanmar has a number of conflicts, ongoing conflicts. The most sort of known is the Rohingya or the Rakhine State conflict, which is between the Muslim minority and the government, and that has been affecting the peacefulness in the country. The countries that improved, Liberia has been experiencing improvements in peace since the peace building or the peacemaking efforts in early 2000s. Iraq, the more localized the conflict in Iraq got, and the more the international community and Iraqi forces gained on the ISIS, the improvements in Iraq happened, and that sort of the level of violence started to sort of decline. I'm trying to get the next slide. Some of the trends we just discussed, I think most of these trends. 62% of countries experienced an increase in the impact of terrorism over the last decade. This means that since 2007, between 2007 and 2008 and 2018, 62% of countries experienced the impact of terrorism. And nearly 1% of global population, that's around 65 million people, are displaced. I'm now going to hand it over to Paulo Pinto, who is going to discuss the positive piece, and I will be back to have a quick chat on the economics of peace with you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mohib. So first, before I start, I'd like to just say how excited I am to see so many people, so many ambassadors that have decided to come and do something about promoting peace. So we have had 6,000 years of conflict on this planet, and we it's really about time that we say enough is enough, and we need to work and do something to change this situation. And so it's really very exciting to be part of this group, and I commend you on making this happen as well. And I'd like to thank Laurie for organizing and leading this whole initiative. So, what is positive peace? So the short answer is, as Mohib has already discussed earlier in his presentation, we have a concept of negative peace, which is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And this is measured by a whole number of gauges. And positive peace relates to the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. A very intuitive way to think about this is, say, for example, when you think of someone that is sick. So what is the opposite of sick? It's healthy. So the person doesn't have any diseases or any ailments. But not having a disease or not having a sickness or an ailment, that in itself is not enough for you to be a happy individual, for you to have a fulfilling life. So you need something more than that. And this is the situation that we have with positive peace. So you can have a low level of negative peace. So that would indicate that you don't, or your country doesn't operate with a lot of violence. That's very well and good. But for the individuals in that country to thrive and for that society to prosper, something else is needed. And we at IEP, we call that positive peace. And if you study economics, if you are interested in economics, you will, especially development economics, you will notice that a lot of the indicators that we compile as positive peace indicators, they are what is usually known in development economics as the micro foundations or the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomic development. So that's the key takeaway for this introduction slide, is that the attitudes and structures and institutions that lead to peaceful societies, they also contribute very, very strongly to prosperity as well. So this is something that is one key aspect of positive peace. So there are 8 pillars of positive peace. So as we approach this issue, there is a well-functioning government. So when your government is representative and efficient, equitable distribution of resources. So when you have low inequality, there's free flow of information when people are free to say what they want and people are free to, and they have access to information. Good relations with neighbors. So when you treat your neighbors well, externally or inside the country as well, high levels of human capital. So this is just a different expression for education. So if your children are well educated, if your workers are well educated, if your citizens are well educated, acceptance of the rights of others. So, for example, you could live in a place where there are minorities, but if these minorities feel represented and they feel that their concerns are being heeded, then you live in a place where there is a very high acceptance of the rights of others, and that is a very strong contributor to this positive peace concept. Low levels of corruption, and that is obvious. Corruption is one of the key factors that lead to susceptibility to conflict and also to lack of economic development. This has been shown many times before in research and in practical studies. And finally, sound business environment, which is how easy it is for you to set up businesses and run your business and create jobs and create prosperity and so on and so forth. So high levels of positive peace are associated with statistically related to higher per capita income for the reasons that I discussed. They are also, this concept of positive peace also includes a notion of resilience, and this is very critical because the concept of positive peace allows a society to resolve their issues through discussion and debate rather than falling back into violence. And I can see that the clock is ticking, so I will speed up a little bit. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a statistical demonstration of how interrelated or how connected to economic prosperity positive peace is. So as you can see, the positive peace, in the positive peace index, lower numbers indicate higher levels of positive peace, and these are associated with very high GDP per capita. So that's also a slide that has some discussion about the constituents of the 8 pillars. And this is just a repetition of what I mentioned before. And in the interest of time, I will let you have a look at this slide on your own time, and you can ask questions about it, of course. And this is the picture of positive peace in terms of geopolitical frontiers. We have countries that are low in negative peace. They tend to be low in positive peace as well, although this is not always the case. And countries that are very high in positive peace, they tend to be high in negative peace, and so in both negative and positive at the same time, although there are some exceptions to that. So this is just a very quick summary of findings. Positive peace has been improving. So more countries have improved than deteriorated, and this is very interesting. Although there is one slide that I'm trying to go to quickly that will raise your attention to a couple of points. Deteriorations over the past 10 years or 12 years or so have been associated with increasing corruption across the world, and we can discuss this as well in the question time. So here are some results as well. So Somalia has the world's lowest positive peace index. Syria and Yemen they have had the largest deteriorations, and this relates to the conflicts that Mohib had discussed before. And on the other end of the scale, you have Russia and Eurasia having very substantial improvements in positive peace. Côte d'Ivoire and Georgia also the country, very high country level improvements. So these are some of the top positive peace country ranking countries in the world, and it's not surprising that they are also very highly ranked in negative peace. So they're very peaceful countries. And these are some of the countries that are struggling with positive peace. And again, as Mohib had said, this has a very strong correlation with negative peace. So in the case of Syria, in the case of South Sudan, Yemen, Central Africa Republic, Somalia, etc. So there is a very strong correlation there. What I wanted to mention is that positive peace has been improving as we mentioned. Lower levels of the positive peace index denote improvements or higher positive peace. So positive peace has been improving all the way from 2005 to 2013, but then it has stabilized from 2013 up to 2017, and we are going to release the new data later this year. There are several reasons why this would be the case. Some of the conflicts that Mohib has already discussed in Syria and in the Middle East, they do have a lagged impact on positive peace also. Of course, you would imagine that conflict would affect, for example, your business environment, the effectiveness of your government, and so on and so forth. And these conflicts have impacted positive peace with a bit of a lag, and so much so that from 2013 onwards, the global positive peace level has stabilized. These are some of the changes that we have discussed. So you can see Georgia and Côte d'Ivoire, very strong improvements, and Rwanda as well. And on the other end of the scale, so we have Greece that had a very strong deterioration in positive peace as a consequence, or in part as a consequence of the great debt crisis or the financial crisis of 2010. And also Syria had a strong deterioration as a consequence of the conflicts that Mohib has already discussed. Now, positive peace and the GPI score, as I mentioned, these concepts are highly correlated. But they are not highly correlated in all of the pillars equally for all of the countries. So high peace countries, they tend to have all of the 8 pillars of positive peace working well for them. And for low peace countries, so the countries that rank low in the GPI, not all of the pillars are working well for these countries. So this is the key aspect of this slide. So there is also a lot of transfer into the different buckets. So we have high peace countries. Some of these countries deteriorate into mid-peace, and some of the mid-peace countries deteriorate into low-peace countries, and there is also an improvement. And this has a lot to do with what's happening in this interrelationship between the GPI and the PPI. This is just a scatter plot of the positive peace against negative peace. As you can see, there is a strong correlation, and the correlation is particularly noticeable when you look at high peace countries, these light blue ones there, and the mid-peace countries. There is a wider dispersion of results, and the same thing for the low peace countries. Now, this is a concept that we use internally and in our reports, which is the positive peace deficit. So you have a positive peace deficit when you are when you have a very high level of negative peace. So you rank very well in the GPI, but you don't rank very well in the PPI. So we consider that is a type of not very stable condition, because as we mentioned, negative peace has this idea of resilience and the ability to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. And not surprisingly, a lot of the countries that have the positive peace deficit, the ones in red there in the slide, they eventually turn to a state of higher violence, as you can see by the arrows going there to the right, which means that the GPI, the negative peace ranking of these countries, is deteriorating. Why? Because they didn't have the positive peace, which is that ability to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. And my final slide is just a comparison of the global positive peace scores with one particular country. In this case is Mexico, but any of your countries can be compared in the same way. And then you can request the data or information from us at the IEP website. And we can highlight where your particular country is, and you can be more effective in your discussion with your colleagues and in your community. So thank you very much, and now I bring it back to Mohib.
Thank you, Paulo. I will quickly go through sort of the economics of peace. One part of the Global Peace Index is the economic value of peace. In this part, we measure the global economic cost of violence, and this cost in 2017, and the reason sort of the 2017 is that we measure for the actual year. The cost of violence in 2017 was 14.8 trillion in purchasing power parity terms, and we use purchasing power parity terms just so that the costs are comparable between countries. For example, comparing United States with Somalia, or comparing it with Mexico, or comparing it with Russia or some country in the Middle East or in the African continent, so we can do that comparison straight away. This number, this 14.8 trillion in purchasing power parity, were equivalent to 12.4% of the global GDP, or $1988 per global citizen. Now, this is a very huge number, and it's very difficult to sort of understand what this means. Let's put it into sort of a perspective, and some of that sort of examples of that would be, for example, if there was a 10% decrease in the global cost of violence, which also means that a 10% improvement in peace, then it will save the global economy $1.48 trillion, or $1.5 trillion in purchasing power parity terms. This number is 10 times larger than the global official development assistance. It's equivalent to all the FDI in 2017. So if this money is sort of saved from the cost of violence and directed into development, this will do a huge amount of good in especially the least peaceful countries and in the developing and least developed countries around the world. To give you a little bit on the composition of the cost, the 37% of the cost includes military expenditure, the 27% is internal security and incarceration, and 16% of the cost or 17% of the cost is related to homicides, global homicides, and then the smaller categories, conflict, armed conflict makes 8% of this cost. There was a reduction of 1%, like a reduction of 1%, as I mentioned, would be equivalent to the official development assistance, or the sort of the global. The 10% reduction will be the total foreign direct investment, and a 10% reduction will also be equivalent to the economies of Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium. So one can sort of put into perspective that even though the level of violence in the world is limited to a number of countries in conflict and a number of other countries suffering from high level of interpersonal violence, that is homicide and violent crimes, the cost this violence imposes on societies is a very big number. I will leave this slide to Laurie, and I'll pass it on to Laurie to do the Q&A as well. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you, Mohib. Thank you, Paolo. And thank you to all the participants who have stayed with us till the end. Mohib and Paolo, I have collated the questions, and I'm going to articulate 3 questions that I think really capture the kinds of questions that have been coming up. And I'll give you a minute to think about them, and then I'll chime in with some other items in the meantime. So one of the questions was about military expenditure. Can you please elaborate on military expenditure? Particularly, does the index suggest that a reduction in military spending leads to greater peace, as opposed to the view held by some that increasing military spending is a deterrent or better enables countries to tackle terrorism? So that's one question about military spending. Then we've gotten several questions about why certain elements are not included in the GPI, namely drugs, suicide, mental health, and sexual assault. And then the third question is, if you could, again, tell us what are the sources of our data, not individually, but as a whole, and how are they verified? And as I'm giving you a moment to collect your thoughts, I just want to let everybody know that some really great questions have come up about whether IEP has produced a subnational index, whether we've drilled down deeper. And at the close of the webinar, I'm going to share with you a link to our Mexico Peace Index. This is the report we're very proud of. We've produced 6 annual Mexico Peace Indices where we look at levels of violence according to Mexico's 32 states, and I know we have a lot of Mexican ambassadors on the webinar here today, so I encourage you to check that out. And then we also got a lot of questions about Russia's score. Just due to time, we don't have time to get into overly or too specific of country scores, but I'm also going to include a link for you to play around with our interactive heat map so you can see how countries fare according to each of the indicators and as compared to other countries. With that, Mohib and Paolo, if you're ready, I'll turn it back to you to answer those questions.
Thank you, Laurie. I will quickly sort of straight away get into the questions. So the military expenditure, there is many views about the military expenditure, I think. We can look across the world and look at different countries. I think what the argument around military expenditure that the Institute for Economics and Peace makes is that there is an optimal or there is an appropriate level of military expenditure that actually do provide protection and safety from certain things that you also mentioned, one of that as terrorism. And beyond that level, what happens is that when there is an overcapacity, countries tend to project this overcapacity in some form in other parts of the world, and that creates violence elsewhere, and that leads to deterioration in peace. So that's one reason that we think that beyond a certain amount, expenditure are actually bad for peace. And then there is the undercapacity issue. When there is not enough military expenditure, the countries that cannot spend or do not have enough resources to allocate to military, they suffer from instability, and they suffer from, and I mentioned a case of Somalia, for example, where a failed state situation where no central authority exists, there is no rule of law, and there is no sort of law enforcement forces to enforce, the law and deter the rise of militants and all that. So this is the two things. And that's where sort of how IEP takes the military expenditure. So beyond a certain amount, military expenditure actually deteriorates peace, and at the certain amount, it sort of it does not have an impact on peace, and that's why we have a weighting of two for military expenditure. What that does is that up to a certain level, military expenditure does not deteriorate peace, but after a certain amount, it does deteriorate peace. The sources of data and how we sort of review and ensure accuracy. The sources of data for each variable are different, as we mentioned, and these sources are globally accepted, very robust, they provide a lot of robust checks around those data. Even though when we source data from them, there is a team of researchers at IEP that spends a better part of the year trying to check the accuracy and try to check the anomalies of these data. If there is any, we get back to these sources of data and ask them to review the data if there is an issue. We also try to compare certain data sets between different sources. For example, military expenditure, the data comes from the military balance from the Institute for International Strategic Studies, but it also comes from CIPRI, and it also comes from one or two other sources. And when we compare these, so that's how we sort of do that. The other question was related to why certain variables are not included. For example, sexual violence, suicide, or drug trade related violence. If you noticed in the societal safety and security domain, we had a violent crime variable. Violent crime variable covers violent assault, sexual assault, and other violent crimes, and that sort of covers the sexual violence and drug trade related violence. On the suicide, yes, we do not include the suicide up until this point. This is one of the things that is part of our discussion, and probably we will see how we go with it. Data is available on it, and this is we haven't sort of yet decided on it, but probably it will be included at some point. I think these were the three questions. Back to you, Lori.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to follow this the same process by which I'm going to send you two more questions and then give you a moment to think about them. And I know we're going a few minutes over. Again, thank you for everyone who's still on. And if you need to drop off the webinar, you can catch up with the recording later. So the question is, can you elaborate why the weighting for the internal and the external conflicts is so specific as compared to the others? So if we can go back to that slide, you'll see there's a 0.56 and a 0.28 in the decimal places there. And then the other, I'll pull that up first. And while I'm giving you a chance to think about that answer, Paulo and Mohib, somebody asked a question, if the United Nations recognizes many more countries, why do we only include 193? And in the back of the Global Peace Index, the question is answered in more detail, but essentially countries that don't provide sufficient data to be included in the index, or that have a very small population, or a very small geography are not included. And in the case of those latter two, it's because the data would really throw off the rest of the index. So Mohib and Paulo, I'll turn it over to you to answer that weighting question if you don't mind.
So there is one reason for internal and external conflicts that we take a specific weighting for it is there is a sort of the approach is that we view the two variables as a single variable. The reason we break it down into two different variables is that internal conflicts affect a different set of countries, while external conflicts, by the definition, does not affect the countries that are involved in it, but being involved in those conflicts actually deteriorates their level of peace because, as I mentioned in the military expenditure part, this is the projection of violence in another country. We don't go into the reason of why the external conflicts happen. This could be, different conflicts that could be, globally sort of, social security, the United Nations Security Council approved conflicts, or it could be some other conflicts. For example, the conflict in Yemen has a different reason. The conflict in Afghanistan was a United Nations Security Council approved, a war, and then the war in Iraq was a different story. And there are certain other conflicts in other parts of the world that involve countries that are not in the region or in sort of, they're not interstate conflict between two countries. What happens is that there is a conflict and an external player is involved. So when we break these two into two different variables, the weighting that was supposed to go into both of them as a shared weighting has been divided into two, and that's why it gets the specific, very sort of decimal point weighting. There's no other sort of reason behind it. So there's a different set of countries that are affected by these two specific indicators. Back to you, Lori.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to give you two more questions about whether certain types of certain factors are included in the index. The first question is whether displacement because of natural disasters is measured in the index. And then are factors like censorship of the media and forced disappearances included in the index? Over to you guys whenever you're ready.
Yes, the first question, displacement due to natural disasters. Yes, our measure for displacement is comprehensive, and it includes every displacement in these 163 countries that are part of the index. And to quickly sort of give a little bit on the why 163 countries, we have sort of one of the rules that were set that countries that have below 1 million population were not included, and the reason was the data availability limited our ability to include these countries. And then the other question was media and forced disappearances. Forced disappearances, yes. We have one of the variables in the presentation as well that does include in the social safety and security. There is the political instability and political aspect of the GPI that includes it, but more specifically, the media or the free flow of information is included in positive peace, and the countries with more freedom for press and media tend to have higher positive peace. On the forced disappearances, I think homicide, part of the homicide and part of the violent crime variables will include that. Just to sort of provide one caveat on that is that when the data is recorded for homicide and for violent crimes and for some of the other crimes, this is police reported data. So these data definitely probably suffers from the underreporting problem, and that is not so easy to solve when you look at the global level of a peace index. I think this is a bit more technical. I mean, if anyone sort of was interested in more technical details, we are more than happy, to provide. They can get in touch, and then we can provide them with more details. They can go to the appendixes of the report and have a lot more details there, and many of their questions, technical questions, would be answered there.
Excellent. Mohib and Paulo, thank you so much. With that, I'm going to conclude the question and answer part of this webinar. Before we sign off, I just want to note that we've received several questions about digging into the relationship between positive and negative peace. So several questions came up about countries that, for instance, improved on one index and deteriorated on another. I appreciate those questions because it seems like there's a bit of collective interest about that. So we will bring that back to a future webinar so we can dig in with more time. In the meantime, we're going to log off in a moment. Once again, I want to thank everyone who's stuck around. Thank you for your patience with the beginning of the webinar. And Mohib and Paulo, thank you so much for your incredibly patient and thorough overview of the Global Peace Index and Positive Peace Index methodology and findings. It's a real treat to have you on, and I know it required an early wake up for you in Australia. So with that, please look out for more emails from us. We'll be in touch with some follow-up materials, and we'll also be in touch to schedule the May webinar that I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.